Definitely baseball is more overwhelmingly male. It has that maleness to it. And what was really interesting was how I was treated. But honestly, I'm not that unused to it. And I think that's probably true for a lot of women.
Hi, I'm Alicia Gonzalez. I'm the Executive Director of Cubs Charities.
Hello, I'm Mariya Chukas. I'm an admissions representative and an alum of Girls in the Game.
I'm Laura Ricketts, and I am on the Board of Directors of the Chicago Cubs and also Chair of the Board of Chicago Cubs Charities.
I'm Kate Lewis, and I am an artist and muralist based out of Chicago.
I'm Colin Faulkner. I'm the Executive Vice President of Sales and Marketing for the Chicago Cubs. Kate, I have a question for you. Your artwork is incredible, and I'm really curious why it's so important to you to incorporate women into your artwork like you have.
Well, when I was doing this project in particular, working with the Cubs, I noticed that I couldn't find much imagery on women in baseball, and I thought it was a nice opportunity to highlight that. If we introduce women into art little by little, that eventually it does become comfortable until we don't have to think about it as an exceptional situation anymore. Well, I feel like it's really important to be surrounded by such powerful women over on this end too, and Laura in particular. What has your experience been as an executive?
Well, I feel like my whole life I've been in environments where it's been predominantly men and very strong men, starting right with my family and my father and 3 brothers. But definitely baseball is more overwhelmingly male. It has that maleness to it, obviously because the players are male, at least for now.
Yeah.
And not all the coaches are male. Most might be, but not all of them. And a lot of the broadcasters are male, not all of them. I'm proud to say that the Cubs will have a female play-by-play announcer
the first ever for the Cubs.
First ever for the Cubs.
Yeah.
I'm very proud of that. When we were looking around, I gave a little nudge here and there, like we need to have some more diversity. We need to have women, we need to have people of color. Not that we weren't doing an awful job, but we weren't doing the best job that we could be doing. So I'm really excited to see that. But it was really an adjustment because just wherever you go in baseball, it seems like it's largely men. And what was really interesting was how I was treated. Like if someone, said a cuss word. It was, oh, excuse me, Laura.
Totally.
It was always, excuse me. Oh, pardon me, Laura. It was like your delicate ears. And finally, I had to use some of my own language around them, just to make my point. Language that I might not normally use, just to make my point with them. But honestly, I'm not that unused to it, and I think that's probably true for a lot of women in their work life, I would guess.
Have you noticed that changing in the few decades, that you've been a professional in your industry?
I think I would love to say yes, it's changing by leaps and bounds. I think there are small ways that it's changing. I guess I shouldn't say small. I guess it's changing slower than I would like it to. But we were just discussing, your wife Jamie and her new position with the Blackhawks, and that's like really remarkable. But what was also remarkable, I would say, was that the way it was covered, at least initially in the papers, it was like, yeah, here they hired this person. And it wasn't the first woman they've ever hired for this role. And I wasn't sure what to think about that, if that was symbolic of the fact that more women are starting to hold some of these roles, or if they lost the nuance of the significance of it.
We talked about that, and Kate or others may not know, but my wife Jamie was named the president of the Blackhawks earlier this year. Like I was like, wow, this is a big deal. Like this is the first team president in Chicago, only the third maybe in sports. I thought it'd be a bigger deal, and so after it came out, I think we were a little bit surprised, and maybe same reaction. I don't know how to react to that. So because of the pandemic, they didn't do a live interview or press conference, so they released photos. So there was print of the articles and written articles, but there was never a live press conference. Well, her name's Jamie, which can be a guy's name too, and so I think when people read it, since there wasn't video of it, they were like,
it's an interesting point. I wonder how many people assumed that Jamie was
a guy.
Man. Yeah.
And I remember I actually called Laura the night before it got announced to tell her, And it was funny. Like I called Laura and I said, hey, the Blackhawks they have a open in their president job and they've hired a new president. And Laura said, oh my gosh, you're going to be the president of the Blackhawks. And I said, no, it's not me, it's my wife. And Laura's reaction was incredible. It was incredible, and it was a great moment. And she is the perfect person for that job, and I'm so proud that she got that job because she's so good at it.
Have you ever actually been in going for the same job at any point?
No, and
Okay.
she's always kind of worked like adjacent to sports. And I remember when she got the call from this recruiter, she came downstairs one day and she's like, you'll never believe I got a call from a recruiter today. And I knew about a job that I mentioned. I said, oh, did you get called about this job? And she said, they called me about being the president of the Blackhawks. She's like, they should have called you. And I was like, no, like you could do that job. And the coolest part was, for our daughter, who's 18 and she's a freshman in college, she, for the past several years, is like, I want to be like Dad. Like, I want to be in sports. Like, I want to be like Dad. But there wasn't a lot of, to Laura's point, like, there's not a lot of women in sports. So there's not a ton of role models that I can point her to. And we certainly have some strong female leaders on our team here at the Cubs, but there's not a team president, And so when Jamie got that job, our daughter was like, wait a second, like, I could be the team president. Whereas before, I think in her mind, she said, well, maybe I can be the social media person, or I can be the
HR.
marketing person, or I can, be an HR, or I can do a job like that. And then it was like, but I could be the team president.
Yeah. But that's interesting because I actually grew up in Chicago with social justice activist parents, and I will say my mother was a very, very strong woman. And I remember at a young age, she said, you are going to need to work harder. Number one, because you're a woman, but number two, because you're Latina too. So people are going to doubt you along the way. So you will have to continue to prove yourself. And so I remember that as a kid. At the time, she worked at the University of Illinois, but the department was all males. And so there were moments where I remember her coming home at night and crying and really being upset and wondering if she was going to be able to continue to move forward. So those moments really stuck out in my mind as a 6, 7, 8-year-old of like, this is going to be hard. It's going to be hard, but that's, I think, also what gave me sort of the strength and the boost to keep going and to move forward. So,
But yeah, I love that story about your connection with your mother, and I'm kind of curious, what do you see yourself providing to our future leaders? So how do you see yourself paving the way for them at the moment?
well, first I'd love to hear about you. Like, what inspired you? You're our future.
Well, I guess you can look at it that way. What inspired me? My mother inspired me. Truly seeing that for myself as a first gen born in the United States, seeing the triumphs that she has been through and overcome, to come here and create a new life and to kind of start from scratch and navigate a new playing field. So knowing that I can do that for my family, knowing that I can do that for those who I mentor and work with across the city has been really motivational for me.
Well, speaking of mentorship, so Girls in the Game, such a great organization here in Chicago, and you grew up with the organization. Yes. So did that also, like, how did that influence you in terms of your own confidence, being surrounded not only by other young women, but really strong women mentors and great executive directors and a staff? Like, how did that influence your own confidence too?
Oh, tremendously. I've typically always been a little outspoken. I'm usually the one who, like, growing up is like, the teacher's like, oh yeah, can you read this paragraph, or can you read this at the assembly? But even though you have those opportunities, there's also the confidence that needs to come with that. And that was something that I can say that I wasn't fully there with. I wasn't the most confident person. And you're growing up in a public school system where you're kind of like, I don't really know where I fit in here, and you're looking for that space to kind of call your own, a space where you find comfort and a space where you are just accepted for who you are. And I think that's what Girls in the Game provided for me, was that I could come there, I could be myself, but I could also learn myself, and I could learn what that looked like to navigate that self-discovery aspect. And so being a part of Girls in the Game, I got to see amazing leaders who weren't afraid to speak their minds, who weren't afraid to give direction, but also weren't afraid to take direction and take feedback. And it gave us kind of the best of both worlds, learning that I could be a very well-balanced person, but I can also influence a lot of people through my testimony.
Alicia and I talk a lot about the power of sport in Cubs Charities work and our mission. What role did sport play for you at Girls in the Game?
Like, I was only exposed to really basketball. Like, that was what I'd seen. That was what was really strong at the school. And so I didn't know that sports were really much of anything. Like, I'd seen sports on TV, but I'd never played them for myself. So getting to experience softball, rugby, doing yoga, volleyball, etc., that kind of paved the way for the sports I got involved in later in life. But then there also came the team aspect, because as I said, I've always kind of been outspoken, but there needed to be that confidence behind it. And where there lacked confidence, there lacked that sense of trust and community building. So having the ability to learn about sportswomanship and learning what that looked like, how to play with a team, how to give someone a pat on the back, how to accept, oh, dang it, I made a mistake in this game, but I now know what I can do to improve next time, and someone's willing to teach me that. It just provided all of those necessary aspects where I don't think I was getting that on a day-to-day basis.
I was interested, I know you came through the Girls in the Game, and one of my experiences in women that have worked on my team and our team that have been really successful was they grew up playing sports.
I think that the aspect of sports is really that team building mindset. And I think that sports really does allow that to happen naturally, where you don't even realize that it's happening, but it just becomes so ingrained in you day to day that you have people who are relying on you, you have people you can rely on, but you also have people who you can ask for help. And it allows for that sense of vulnerability where when you get into those professional workspaces, you learn to lead, but you also learn that there's times to sit back and observe. And it does provide that awesome balance where in a traditional setting, or maybe without sports or without something to really engage in activity-wise, you may not necessarily see that. So that would be my perspective on it.
The one thing that I was thinking about while you were talking is not only the importance of teamwork in sport, but also mental health. Young women, I think, have more tendency to be more self-critical than young boys do. And so I think the ability to have a stronger support system that sport provides is really helpful for the mental health piece of young ladies or young women. But also, as a runner, which was a pretty individualized sport, I used to say to my kids when I was coaching them, there isn't a problem you can't take with you on a run. You might not be able to solve it, but you'll have more clarity afterwards. And I think that's something that also happens on the field, or when the physical activity gives you that.
Yes, I 100% agree with that, because yes, we did focus heavily on sports, but there was also that balance of talking about your confidence, talking about your self-esteem, having those conversations that I know personally I didn't have in the household. And so it's not just how athletic are you, because you do have to go out there. It is a mental game, honestly. And so if your mental state isn't the strongest, then sometimes it may affect your ability to play, and play in all aspects too. So not just on the field, but off the field. So I appreciate you bringing up that aspect.
I love Girls in the Game for many reasons. Being someone that played sports growing up, and all the importance of being on a team, but also the girls that they get engaged in their programs. So important to help prepare them and lift them up. You go to their website and there'll be a picture of a young girl and it says, "We build confidence." And then it talks about voice. We help girls find their voice. We help, they build self-esteem. All of those things are so important, particularly if we want girls to become women that go into professions or in positions that oftentimes women haven't held. Oftentimes you don't have role models, right? A lot of role models, and maybe women of color even the more so. You can't see those people and say, I want to be like her. Man, she's amazing. I mean, there are plenty of them, right? Now, but do they get do we see them as obviously as we see men there? And so it's really important that programs like Girls in the Game exist and help build those aspects and help girls prepare for that. And honestly, that little girl on that website, she inspires me. I mean, there are people in my life that inspired me, like Billie Jean King and Ruth Bader Ginsburg and Kamala Harris, of course, Michelle Obama, right? I mean, she's the queen. But anymore, what really inspires me the most are young women. I'm just thrilled by all the women that have run for office for the first time.
Yes.
First of all, it impacts the conversation that they have in the campaign, right? But then it impacts how we govern ourselves, how we think of ourselves, and how our government works. And it's the same is true in the corporate world too, and in any industry or any environment. So what inspires me most now are actually people like you. And what do you think young women can take away from this type of a dialogue?
Yeah, I think that young women will first of all see the representation that's participating in this type of dialogue, but then also know that these doors are here for them to open themselves. These doors have been opened, and know that people are rooting for them. And so a lot of times you do need that push. You do need to see yourself in these settings. And I think that having conversations like this is really going to just kind of inspire young women and honestly everybody to know that there are people out there who fill these roles. There isn't a specific mold for these roles, and that anyone can go out there and persevere and kind of be the representation that they want to see as well.
I really think everything starts with dialogue. I think there's so much work that needs to get done in this world in order for us to be honest, repair a lot of damage that's happened, and sort of how do we come together when that happens through actual conversation and getting to know one another. And so I would just go even so far as to say not even just young women, but young men need to be a part of these conversations, because they need to grow up like your sons, seeing their father support their mother, seeing their father support their daughters. I think that's really important, that we need to make sure that young boys, men that are older men also are hearing these conversations and learning from them. So like that, I'll just pivot to you really quickly, Colin. Like, if you're gonna go home tonight, you're gonna have dinner with your kids, like what are you gonna say you did today?
It's a great question. Like, I think maybe to your point, it's about having the conversation. And like, I think as guys or as myself, I don't want to speak for all guys, I'll just speak for myself. Like, it can be uncomfortable to have that conversation, because I'm like, well, I don't understand the perspective, or I don't understand what I can do. I'll probably go home tonight and we'll sit down at dinner and we'll talk about what we talked about, and it'll hopefully then open up a conversation. That would be the goal, is to open up a conversation with the kids about what's their role in this, or what's the future like, or what are their views. But I think even more than conversation, just our kids pay attention to your actions,
Yes.
as much as they, or more than they pay attention to your words. And so I'm curious if there's things, one of my questions from this is, what are things that I can do or other guys can do to be supportive or to help? I would love to hear that.
No, it's one of the reasons why I was glad that it wasn't an all-women panel,
Yeah.
because it's really important that men, and particularly I would
Yes.
say white men, be a part of that dialogue and be a part of the solution.
Yes, absolutely.
You know, if you're going to hold down 51% of the population, that affects the entire population. And we have to lift all people up.
Yep.
You know, to do that, we really need everybody's help.
Yes.
Everybody has a role to play in that. So I want to thank you for being a part of this
Yes.
conversation. And I want to thank you for being Jamie's husband and being such a great spouse, clearly. And I'm so proud of her.
And just to touch on your question briefly, I think something that you said in your response at first is really key. You said you're speaking for yourself. You're not speaking for all men. You're not speaking for an entire demographic. And I think that just kind of shows the importance of representation and the importance of seeking new perspectives. And so your question of like, what can more men do? Seek new perspectives and have a diverse crowd at the table and bring them into these dialogues, because I don't speak for all Black women. I don't speak for all women. I don't speak for any specific demographic. I speak from myself and what I've been through, and hopefully we can use that to inspire and kind of go back to that original question of like, what can young people and what do people take away from this conversation? It's that more people need to have this conversation. And so I really appreciate you asking that, for sure.
Something I think is really interesting just hearing this dialogue is to think how important it is and has been, especially in this experience here as part of this panel, to notice that everyone sees vulnerability as a strength too.
Yes.
I love that you mentioned that, Alicia, and that I think, you know, something that you're doing even as a male, or that everyone here is doing, is holding space for people to have these conversations, and knowing that, you know, our weaknesses are also our strengths, and that we don't always have to be so confident that we're outwardly confident. It's also important to own, like, you know, some of the inner dialogue that we're also having, but to know that that's part of our learning process also, that it's not considered a weakness to want to reach out to other people and ask for help or advice or mentorship in some way. And, you know, as an artist with those people, I think it's incredible that everyone's open to having that conversation. It's not something I think is very common, so I'm really grateful to be a part of it.
I'm also really excited back to different perspectives, like, and opening up dialogues. I think the work that you've done with your art for this project, I think is going to actually open up a dialogue. So I think it's really cool that when people see that, it's going to open up a dialogue for people to have a conversation. And it might be messy, and not everybody might not agree on certain things, but at least it opens up a conversation. So I think your work is allowing that conversation to happen, which I think is really cool.
I think part of the importance of art is in making people uncomfortable, or seeing, you know, questioning what it is that that we think we need to do, or the conversations we're supposed to have, and imagery that we're not used to seeing, and how does that make us feel? You know, that's the point of art. And I think for such a traditional sports industry to be interested in hosting that conversation is really remarkable. It's,
art
something.
and sport heal.
Very much so.
It's interesting. I think a lot of women experience how authentic am I going to be in this situation, and am I going to make somebody uncomfortable, or how far am I going to take it?
Right.
I know we had an experience at the Cubs where we had a consultant years ago to consult us on some of the things we might change around here. You might have been a part of this meeting, I don't know, but I disagreed with some of what they were suggesting. And I said, I disagree. I think if we do that, we're losing a really important part of what people associate with the Cubs. And he said, and I was in a room of all men, probably, I don't know, 20 men. And he said, well, but this is more ballsy. And I said, oh, okay. Well, I'm a woman, and I'm a queer woman. So that's maybe why I'm not getting why you really think this is so important that we do this. Just to call him out on using that kind of a language and that kind of a mindset. It was a bit uncomfortable, but I just felt like I had to push back a little bit, you know.
Good for you.
I don't think I was in that meeting.
Well, fortunately, everyone laughed, and then they're like, oh, he's like, oh, you know, poor word choice. I apologize. And it was fine, but it was. I mean, I think everyone. We all have experiences where we have to like make a statement, or have to like figure out what's okay, like how far am I going to push back? And you want to be your authentic self always. But it's like how you carry yourself as your authentic self. I've also had experiences just where, you know, back when I was a young lawyer and I wanted to do more venture capital work at my firm, and there were no women in that practice group. And talking to his senior partner who ran it, and you know, rather than encourage me, he was really discouraging to say, oh, you know, it's mostly men in this practice group. And I'm like, okay, that's okay. There's mostly men in this law firm and in my family and in my law school and
in the world.
I said, well, yeah, in the world. Actually, more women in the world than men. But and then he said, you know, we use a lot of rough language. And I said, yeah, so do I. And I used some of my own. I had to make the point. And then he said to me, well, we use a lot of sports analogies. And that was many years ago. And I said, well, I grew up with sports. I played sports through all my childhood into high school. But I know every woman's had an experience of some kind of that nature to be, this isn't for you. Well, I've really appreciated this dialogue today. I mean, a couple times the notion of perspective has come up in many different ways, and I really appreciate the perspective of each one of you and sharing your perspective today. I think we need to have a lot more of these dialogues in our society, and it'll help inform our perspective, our own perspective, by hearing that of others. So thank you.
Thank you
for sharing today.